So first, what do you need to know about the Cochrane 2025 review? Well, first, reviewers by the Cochrane collaborations are widely regarded as the gold standard of systematic reviews and are widely cited by health authorities and prestigious medical journals like the British Medical Journal. Now, the same British Medical Journal has celebrated the Cochrane 2025 review as a comprehensive anti-misinformation review that showed that HPV vaccination reduces the incidence of cervical cancer by as much as 80%, and that if the vaccine is given before 16 years of age. Now, I actually call that misinformation, and often this kind of misinformation is communicated because many people just read the abstract of a research article and do not actually bother to read the whole paper. And this Cochrane review is actually a 300-page plus long document. And the most important information begins after page 200, if you can bear to last that long. Now, one thing I noticed to begin with in the Cochrane review is this strange sentence. Cervical cancer is a common cancer in young women and people with uterine cervix. Now, as if people with uterine cervix can be anything other than women. I mean, they really should keep this nonsense out of science. Well, what about the rest of the review? Is it any better? Well, here you have the summary of the risk of bias for each of the epidemiological studies that were included in the review, according to the outcome of the study, according to the outcome that the study investigated. And here was the most relevant outcome, which is invasive cervical cancer. And this table, you see, continues, or there are several tables. Now here you have other outcomes like adenocarcinoma in situ. And you can here see that there is a lot of studies, and most of them are rated at either critical or serious risk of bias. Same goes for these other types of cancers that are caused by the HPV.
Just one question. We here seen in this table on the right side, there is a red and saying that is too biased. Can you explain us what is this means? Serious bias and critical bias?
Yes. So basically, what does the risk of bias metric mean? It basically tells us the likelihood that a study contains methodological errors that could invalidate its results. So studies, for example, that are rated as having serious or critical risk of bias have substantial errors in design and analysis and reporting that make their results and conclusions essentially invalid or at the very least very highly suspicious.
Okay.
So this is, again, the same table summary for the head and neck cancer. And this table is actually not in the Cochrane review. This is my summary. And basically, my aim with this table was to summarize how many studies out of all examined for each clinically relevant outcome have been judged by the Cochrane reviewers themselves to be either at critical or serious risk of bias. And you can see from the last column that anywhere from 80 to 100% of all studies examined have that serious or critical at risk of bias rating. Now, in spite of this huge serious bias of the studies included in the review, the Cochrane authors concluded that there was moderate certainty evidence that HPV vaccine reduced the incidence of cervical cancer and high-grade SIM+3 lesions. Now, never mind the fact that only 4 studies that supposedly look at cervical cancer out of the total 20 were at moderate risk of bias. And the rest were at high or critical risk of bias. So in short, if the majority of your studies are of such poor quality, by your own assessment, you cannot claim that this is moderate certainty evidence. And even moderate certainty evidence is not something really I should be advertising. So the take-home message is that no matter how highly regarded by the medical establishment these systematic review studies are, like the Cochrane 2025 review, well, they can only be as good as the quality of the studies included in the review. And in the case of the Cochrane review, we can safely say that garbage in equals garbage out. So I wouldn't base any policies for HPV vaccination on the basis of the Cochrane review.
Yeah, there is one interesting thing where they're saying what is statistics, and they say there is 3 lies. One is lie, second one is big lie, and third one is statistics. We can see this maybe that they're using this kind of statistics for presenting marketing and not really presenting scientific proofs.
Well, to me, it's even worse because, again, you have the review itself that the conclusions of the review are not supported by the very evidence that is presented in the review. So that is just misinformation.
And they admit it.
They admit it. Yeah, they do admit it.
Okay.
So, but it gets even worse than that. So I said there were 4 studies that were cited as moderate risk of bias and cited as evidence for invasive cervical cancer risk reduction. And what is particularly bad that one of these 4 studies did not even look at invasive cervical cancer at the outcome. It only looked at persistent HPV infection. Then we have additional 2 of the 4 studies, again cited as providing moderate evidence for invasive cervical cancer reduction, and they make demonstrably false claims. This first study claims that it found that HPV vaccination almost eliminated cervical cancer in young adolescents. The second study makes a similar claim. It's just they state that according to their findings, there was a very significant, over 70% reduction of cervical cancer in 23 to 30-year-old women. But again, I am quite skeptic. So I always I don't normally take people at their word. I'd like to see more. I'd like to dig deeper to see what they're basing their claims on. So if we can go back to the presentation and next slide. So here is basically the official British cervical cancer statistics that basically entirely invalidate the claims of these 2 studies, because at the bottom you see the incidence rate for the 0 to 19-year-old age group, and it's basically 0. I mean, it's a flat line. And then you have next 20 to 24-year-old age group. Again, it's a flat line. It actually increases a bit after the HPV vaccines were introduced. And now with the age group between 25 to 34, you see that incidence of cervical cancer actually increases, and it continues to increase even after HPV vaccines were introduced into the schedule. So again, this is official UK statistics on cervical cancer, and it totally invalidates the claims of both studies. And here is just a cleaner graph with just one age standardized line. And again, it shows that the rate of cervical cancers in the UK have been rapidly declining, and they have reached their lowest point long before HPV vaccines were introduced in the immunization schedule. Now we have a very similar picture with the Australian cervical cancer statistics. And these are actually really important because Australia has very high vaccination rates, and over about 80% of adolescents have received at least 1 dose of HPV vaccine. So if we should see an impact of HPV vaccination on a population level, this would be the place, Australia, and yet no impact. And again, same picture, US cervical cancer statistics. So what can we conclude?
Let me ask before this. I had also interview with Aaron Siri. We spoke about other vaccines, and he showed in his book also that all these diseases already declined much more before they introduced vaccines. And they even changed the way of statistics after they introduced vaccines, because after these statistics, in any case, that will decline cases because they change the way how they measure. And I see the same case, that means reduction of disease even before vaccine claim. And they are still claiming that vaccines saved millions of lives.
Well, I cannot comment on Aaron Siri's book. I haven't read it yet. But when it comes to cervical cancer, again, I always say, you want me to believe something, show me the data. I've shown you the data. Where is the impact? I really don't see it. I mean, forgive me if I'm blind. But
let's continue with the presentation.
So one-line summary about the Cochrane review was provided by Peter Goche, who is a friend of mine and a very highly acclaimed scientist and expert in clinical trial design and also in systematic reviews and assessment of studies or observational studies. And he stated that the BMJ and the Cochrane hyped the HPV vaccine in the extreme, and indeed they have. And this is my one-slide summary of the Cochrane review on HPV vaccines, and it shows that basically the propaganda that resulted from the review findings is completely contradicted by the actual evidence presented in the review itself about the degree of methodological bias of the existing relevant studies. Next, I would like to present a topic that is apparently not discussed at all in the context of mass HPV vaccination programs, and that is the use of oral contraceptives, or as I abbreviate, OCPs, in the population that has the highest HPV vaccine uptake, which is young women. Now, here is a very recent study published in 2024 that found that HPV vaccination actually increases the risk of cancer in women who take OCPs. So here you have on the very left at baseline women who do not take OCPs and are either vaccinated, which is in this dark pink or reddish box, or unvaccinated, which is the blue box. Now, in comparison to them, women who do take oral contraceptives, and this is what you see, these boxes on the right, they actually have higher risk of cervical cancer. And among those OCP takers, those that are vaccinated, which are these, again, dark pink boxes, they actually have the higher risk of cervical cancer. So basically, what this means is that HPV vaccination is actually likely to increase cervical cancer rates further down the track unless HPV vaccinated women who take OCPs are warned to attend regular screening. However, there is evidence from studies showing that HPV vaccinated women have low screening rates because the vaccine seems to give them false sense of security.
In the last interview, we call it this negative efficacy.
Well, yes, that's negative efficacy because the vaccine is apparently doing exactly the opposite. It has the opposite effect.
Okay.
And so, in spite of these findings, the authors concluded that the elimination of cervical cancer will be achieved through increased HPV vaccine rates and efforts to increase screening. Now, while I agree with the latter, I absolutely disagree with the former, as I believe it is highly logical, because if HPV vaccines increase the risk of getting cervical cancer in OCP users, then further reduction in cervical cancer cannot be achieved by increasing HPV vaccination rates. But it seems that the authors were not comfortable with the results of their study, so they made, at least in my opinion, a very lame attempt to justify them, or to explain them away. And so what they stated here is that the finding that the OCP users had higher rates of cancer among the HPV vaccinators is probably due to the fact that the data on cervical cancer was too small in this study. But if this is indeed the case, why does it not invalidate the observed increases in cervical cancer for other acknowledged risk factors, such as smoking? And the reason why is because it's probably a very tough pill to swallow for the researchers. And here is what I mean. As the table that is presented in this paper shows, the cervical cancer numbers in the HPV vaccinated OCP users are no smaller than the cervical cancer numbers in smokers who use oral contraceptives. So if smoking is then acknowledged by the authors as increasing the risk of cervical cancer in OCP users, so should likewise the HPV vaccination be equally acknowledged, because that is what the data show.